So, dear colleagues, shall we continue our discussion? So the idea is to complement this introductory bird's eye view by showing you a number of slides. That's also in order to structure a little bit our discussion. But before starting, do you have questions so far? Is it clear? Do you like to have some more explanation, or is it fine so far? Can we continue? Then let's do so. Well, this is obviously the pictures which are very well known, especially to people here. This is more the situation 2015 when people came in, and that was the situation where each country behaved on its own way, again, not being prepared to deal with such high numbers. And the more so because of the problem of Greece is that it's surrounded by non-Schengen states. Think about that for a while. So Greece is a Schengen state, which is very nice, but it's surrounded by non-Schengen states, whether it's Bulgaria, whether it's Serbia or Macedonia, or the FYROM, I should say, here in Greece. So, and that's a problem as well. So for Greece, it was of course very difficult to handle the numbers arriving on the islands. And when they waved them through, they went on their way where? Well, essentially they went to Hungary, to Budapest, but this clearly is München. This is in Germany, the Polizei. And from there on, of course, it was a terrible situation. So again, it illustrates just the way we were not prepared. This is, in fact, a more recent kind of picture. This is what you could refer to as the second flow. So the big influx was from Syria, the civil war, and they were over the millions. Let's not forget, I mean, what the colleague said over there. I mean, relatively speaking, it's not that high numbers. In fact, Turkey hosted and hosts still more inhabitants from Syria compared to the European Union as a whole. It's immense. Poor country like Lebanon or Jordan, it's immense. The responsibilities these countries have on their shoulders in a way. And here is indeed the several dimensions of what I wanted to show to you. So the background of the crisis, well, when this crisis was on its height, how do we deal with the border issue? Clearly, we were prepared, but not to receive such high numbers. And what is the situation by now, and how to deal with the future? Well, this is, of course, the background of the crisis, and it's very difficult to try to do something positive to change the situation. Poverty and conflict, whether it's conflict and poverty or poverty and conflict. In Syria, it was more the conflict, and in Africa, it's the poverty and the conflict. And this is a situation where we are confronted with, and certainly versus a stable and a peaceful area in Europe, which is, of course, if you want to find review somewhere, then obviously Western Europe is the place to be and the place to go through. The wars, the conflicts in our neighborhood, North Central Africa, Middle East, and Asia, the need for safe havens in the direct and stable. I mean, so far so good, is it? I mean, that's clear. Here is then the reference to the borders. And the big issue was, of course, we dealt with the abolishment of the internal border controls already in the 80s, beginning of the 90s, let's say 95. When the implementing Schengen Convention entered into force was 95. And then we decided to abolish the internal border controls, the internal passport identity controls. And that also for Amsterdam, Athens, so that was of application. And The external dimension of this problem was only dealt with later on. So when we put on the Schengen system, it was 95 and following years. So in a way, we liberated the internal movement much earlier than we were able to establish an external regime. And the big issue of what we have been experiencing is that whereas internal borders were open, we were not able to control our external borders. That's one of the main deficiencies of what we have experienced so far. So the internal borders were open, and we were not able to control our external borders. This is the Schengen situation. And as I said earlier, for Greece, of course, it was a terrible issue to be a partner in Schengen, but surrounded by non-Schengen states, whether it's Bulgaria. And you see, I mean, they are upcoming. I mean, they're not as yet participating. We are now discussing this in the context of the Bulgarian presidency of the Council. It's on their priority list to get access to the Schengen cooperation. But this is the problem in a way. It illustrates also the problem Greece has been confronted with. So if you want to deal with this issue of this massive influx from what you have experienced from Turkey, with all your islands here very close to the Turkish coast, then it's of course very difficult to try to make this the subject matter of a collective responsibility. For Italy, in a way, it's a bit easier because they are surrounded by Schengen. But this is the Schengen area. How long will it take before Bulgaria, Romania will get access to Schengen? I mean, they are already fully prepared. The Commission has already come to the conclusion a couple of years ago that Bulgaria and Romania are prepared to participate and to get access to it. But there are still a couple of member states who have some hesitations and reluctance. But that has to do with the internal stability of Bulgaria, the corruption and so on. I mean, it's more about the rule of law, the internal values. But it's on the table. It's on the table, but simply to show you that for Greece it was not easy to cope with the situation in view of the fact that you are surrounded by non-Schengen states. The next one is the crisis of 2015. Well, taken by surprise, that's of course not really the right terminology. We were aware of what was happening in the Middle East. We were aware of the follow-up of the Arab Spring situation. But nevertheless, although we had put in place legislation, this was not simply enough to handle these people coming by thousands per day or per week, etc., etc. So it was essentially a complete lack of capabilities, whether it's infrastructure, of human capacity, that was the stumbling block to deal with the high number of incoming people. Here we are, the responsible member states. There was a legislation, so the Dublin regulation was in force already at that time. And although I will show you that more in detail tomorrow, there are criteria. The first criteria is how to protect the interests of minor people. Then there is a reference to the history of the migrant. Has he already visited one of the member states of the European Union? Perhaps there is a tourist visa, or he was for a longer period already legally residing, then he has to be transferred to that country and so on. But essentially, de facto situation has been that the country where the migrant arrived had to be considered responsible. And that, of course, is an outcome of once you apply the criteria of the Dublin regulation. So the first criteria is how to protect the interest of the minor. If there are relatives, so he arrives on a Greek island, but he has an uncle or an aunt in Germany, the idea of Dublin has always been that he had to be transferred to Germany. But that situation was, of course, in view of the high numbers, very difficult to distinguish, to identify. So essentially, we have applied that remaining category there where the migrant has entered, either legally or illegally. That is the responsible member state. And that, of course, gave rise to quite a number of problems here in Greece, but also in Italy. And because of the lack of solidarity, we were not able really to distribute these charges over the member states. And in the meantime, by the thousands, we have seen all the dramatic pictures, and we have also not noticed quite a few of casualties in the Mediterranean, for drowned people and so on, smuggling. And that is my question: is it a European problem? I don't know whether you have given a thought about that. Is it a European problem, or should we have opened up our focus much earlier to also try to involve other stable areas in the world to try to combat this problem? There was legislation with regard to responsible member state, reception procedures, qualification. We will go through them tomorrow more in detail. However, content-wise, not appropriate to deal with the high numbers. So, since 2016, the Commission has put, I told you during our first hour, so now this has been more or less been submitted and subjected to the application of the supranational procedures. So it's now up to the Commission to present proposals for legislation. Commission has presented 23 amending proposals to try to improve the characteristics and the contents of the European Union legislation, but most of them have not as yet been fully agreed upon. And the idea is to come to final conclusions at the end of the presidency of Bulgaria, so to say. So ultimately in June to come to final conclusion. But then we have not solved as yet the whole problem, because then we have still to deal with relocation, resettlement, etc., etc. So there is a program now being scheduled, running from October last year up to mid-2019. Who is a refugee? That's also a very important issue. So, of course, if you analyze the text of the Convention of, and I will show you that also tomorrow more in detail. If you analyze the text of the Convention of Geneva, but also the Qualification Directive of the European Union, the focus is clearly the refugee on the traditional refugee, so being prosecuted because of political convictions, activities, etc., etc., whereas we are in need of a much more broader concept. And as I explained during our first hour, we did so in a way at the EU level by establishing and developing new concepts: subsidiary protection and displaced persons. So subsidiary protection to protect those people, references to the Balkan crisis, to the Yugoslav crisis, who are not really to be assessed as refugees, but clearly in need of protection. And that's why we have labeled them as beneficiaries of subsidiary protection. And those who are on the move, in need of protection, however, without having been fully examined the justification of their application, these are the ones which we qualify as displaced persons. But it's a third category of migrants which are to be protected according to what we have prescribed to ourselves in legislation, essentially directives and regulations. Then there is this major category of the economic refugee looking for a better future, and the impression has always been that the second wave coming from Central Africa are to a large extent, majority, I don't know exact figures by the way, but to a large extent are to be qualified as economic refugees. Do they really require to be protected, or is it more for humanitarian considerations that you want to take them on board, or is it a category which you could welcome in view of the fact that you have developed this kind of legal migration avenue, which we come back to tomorrow and also the day after. So the economic refugees, I don't know if you have comments or questions about that. My impression is, but it's of course very difficult to justify and to this, that essentially in the second wave, the people coming from Africa are essentially young Africans, men who are trying to pave the way for family to come and to prepare for a better future. It's quite a number as well. And illegal migration has to do with smuggling and human trafficking. Of course, that's that separate category which we want to combat. But in a way, so these categories have been available from the start, very inventive. I think, again, subsidiary protection since the Balkan crisis, displaced persons, but nevertheless, in view of the high numbers, we were not completely prepared to apply this fully in a very complete manner. The situation 2016 and 2017, the number of applications has gone down. There is a move from the Eastern Mediterranean avenue to the central one or to the western one, access to Spain. And everybody is convinced that we have not yet faced the end of the crisis, in view of the fact that there is an upcoming ID, climate refugees, so people who are victim of climate considerations, climate change and so on, which might give rise to a new number of migrants looking for a better future. And then certainly, because we are located in the neighborhood, Europe could be a destination for them as well. What we are looking for is a sustainable kind of solution. And I think if you assess the relevance of the proposals of the European Commission, essentially their focus is on sustainable external borders. How to a certain really good control at the external borders. But in the Mediterranean, that's not so difficult, that's not so easy to apply. And essentially, it's still the situation that Greece, Italy, and Spain, to a lesser extent, are also, in view of the legislation as it is now in application, are the responsible authorities to deal with the external border control. Frontex can assist. Frontex has been given a new mandate, that is the reference to the European Border and Coast Guard, end of 2016. So it adds to the responsibilities also at the EU level, but still, essentially, we are confronted with the situation where the member states themselves are the competent bodies. And no agreement has been reached. That will be the conclusion of tomorrow and the day after. And that's the reason why now migration is one of the 4 or 5 big issues which are now being listed on the agenda of the heads of state and government. The internal dimension, the external dimension, and the legal migration dimension being one of them. And the idea being, but let's hope that that will be realized, that we can find final conclusions in June, May, June, ultimately next year. And next year, there the focus is to the European Parliament elections taking place in June 2019. And that's also a kind of period where new other political events are coming in, a new composition of the European Commission, new nomination, Mr. Tusk himself, Mogherini, the mandates expiring, etc., etc. So that's an idea. Mr. Donald Tusk, so the present President of the European Council, he has, in fact, mentioned mid-2019 as the ultimate date to be completely in charge also of the migration problem. Yes, please.
Right. Since you mentioned Donald Tusk, and I was wondering whether, and his agenda on these issues, I was wondering what your position is on the gap that has been developed between the Commission and the European Council on the issue of relocations.
Yeah, why do you refer to a gap?
Because in the Commission's proposal for Dublin 4, this is the core issue and the most difficult one.
Oh, yes, that one.
The commissioner, the Greek commissioner, really stands by it, while in his latest opinion, President Tusk said that we should not be so
I understand
attached to this principle because it's more divisive than it's useful.
Yes, I understand what you mean. So, in fact, when introducing his agenda, which is formally called the Leaders' Agenda, so that's a document circulating now since October last year, indeed, in one of the first alineas referring to relocation so far being applied in a manner which is not effective, as if everybody has accepted that it's not effective. Well, it may be not effective, but it doesn't mean that for the majority, let's put it that way, of the heads of states of government, we should try to find other means to solve this problem. So here clearly the reference is to his background, his national background as the former Prime Minister of Poland, is my assumption, that he is nevertheless impressed by the resistance and the objections put forward by the Poles, by the Hungarians, by the Czechs in a way, that they do not want to participate in this relocation system. But that's not really, and I don't know, have you also read the conclusions of the European Council in this, and also the way he has presented it during a press conference? It was very unclear, so to say. I think he has mentioned something I've met with understanding. We are looking for compromises, but that will be difficult. That was more or less his statement. So relocation, what is the issue? Should we really push hard on making all the member states, at least those who are participating in this field of policy, to take their share in the process of distributing those people who have made applications for international protection? Or should we try to leave them out of that picture by demanding from their sides, the Hungarians, the Poles, and the Czechs, for example, to pay another kind of of share in order to solve the problem? I have some mixed feelings about this whole issue in a way, because of course you can understand also the problems of the Hungarians or the Slovaks or the Czech in a way, but their argument that's a cultural or it's religion, that's of course very difficult to accept. But in a way all these countries are still in a process of transformation, isn't it? I mean, they're facing economic problems. They are in a situation of economic backwardness still. And, for example, the Czechs, the Slovaks, but also Hungarians, they have quite some problems to manage their internal problems with regard to Roma people, etc., etc. So they have other issues, but they base their arguments on very bad arguments, I think. The cultural and the religious argument, that's not really, but in a way I have a certain understanding of their problems, but then they should make another kind of offer, which you are trying to do, by the way, during the last meetings, by making available an amount of money, essentially. And that is an issue. I don't know whether you have also read the Dublin 4 kind of proposal of the Commission even. So those countries who, on a temporary basis for a year or so, are not participating in the relocation, they are asked for a financial contribution, 250,000 per migrant, if I'm not mistaken. What is your position about it? Is that acceptable or should we not accept it? I'm a bit hesitant about it in view of the fact that many of the Eastern European countries, again, are in this stage of transformation, unemployment, youth unemployment, etc., etc. But of course, in principle, they have to make available also a contribution in this problem.
Right. My position is that on all this, except from the Roma issue, all the other things about economic problems and high unemployment and youth unemployment, so on, I think that nobody is worse off than Greece. So I don't follow that closely.
But you see, politically, I was also a bit I was not surprised by Tusk, but I was a little bit surprised about Dublin IV proposal of the Commission, that they in fact has already provided in a certain flexibility with regard to those member states not participating for a limited period of time in this relocation discussion. So I think it will be very difficult to push it through that all member states have to be kept responsible in this. How to do that? How to do it? Because it's a question, of course, you can argue then they do not comply with their obligations, so far so good. What then? Then you can start an infringement procedures. Well, we have now that experience with Poland, which is a more fundamental discussion about the rule of law situation in Poland. And of course, you can invoke the assistance of the Court of Justice, and then the famous, what we refer to as the nuclear option, Article 7 of the Treaty on the European Union. Where are we going to end in this? And on the other hand, there is also that argument, the numbers we require them to take on board are very limited. It's about a couple of hundreds, isn't it? I mean, it's not that much. And still, it's simply no, niet, veto. And that, of course, is not acceptable.
Just a remark on what you say, if what I've read is correct, the Hungarians, if you read their daily press and the news and all of these things, they are convinced that there are waves of migrants waiting outside the borders in order to flood Hungary, and waves of asylum seekers. And if what I've read, and so they consider that as number one problem for Hungary, the mass of asylum seekers waiting to enter. And if what I've read is correct, in the last 2 years they have accepted three asylum seekers. So it's very...
Although they are bound as well to the Convention of Geneva.
Of course.
The point is that, of course, their arguments are false to the extent that they mix up migrants with criminals also. That's also a horrible kind of presentation. So to simply mix it up and... So how are we going to solve this? The point, so Tusk is flexible, the Commission in a way has shown some flexibility. So my guess is that they can try to find an alternative mechanism to deal with the problem. It's about politics. I don't know what politics will do. I mean, if you ask my Prime Minister, he's very severe on that, and they have to pay their share. And that's it. And otherwise, what otherwise? What are we going to do? Suspension of voting rights is not so easy to accomplish. I mean, what we can accomplish from a legal perspective is a condemnation by the Court of Justice. Okay, if they do not comply with the judgment of the Court of Justice, what can we do? We can impose on them penalty payments. And obviously, if you want to enhance and enforce penalty payments, then politically you might end up rather in a difficult political situation. But that's more or less of what we can accomplish. The Article 7, a nuclear option, is dealing with, in a way, other issues. Don't you think so? Rule of law, democracy, and so on. So that is probably, but I'm thinking aloud, That's probably not an avenue being available in this context, so that you can really, at a certain decide to suspend voting rights and so on. Penalty payments, that's where this situation might end. But I've not a final solution on this. So let's see what our heads of state and government are able to accomplish in this respect. Well, then, just to illustrate a little bit, but I warn again, I mean, the sources are not always the Council and the European Commission, but I thought it interesting to take it, to show you just the numbers. Refugee asylum seekers 2015, I don't know, I mean, there were many more in the European Union. However, there were many illegal migrants, so refugees and asylum seekers. So when the reference is to 722,000, then that should be the outcome of the assessment of the applications, well-founded application. But notice Turkey. So they received quite a number, in fact much more involved with the crisis, the Syrian crisis, the civil war, compared to our situation. North America, of course, they played a role as well, although I do not know when the reference is to 93,000, probably, I don't know, Southern American refugees coming from these countries are perhaps also involved, I do not know, but the point is 2014, 2015, it shows more or less how this charge, how these responsibilities have been distributed at the global level, Asia and the Pacific in a very marginal manner. Russia, 70,000, but certainly not coming from the Middle East, all of them. Well, this is also the scheme, which illustrates clearly October 2015 as the summit, the height of the crisis, and then the reference is to first-time applicants and secondary migration, so people whose application has been dismissed and they make another effort somewhere else in the European Union, simply for reasons of illustration. And it shows indeed that we are now, and the slides on 2016 and 17 are still to come. This was the crisis at its height, and the number of refugees, you can see that here. I don't know whether is there a pointer on this one? Oh, this is not a good idea. Is that Here, that is 75,000. So that is the way this has been introduced, and clearly is that we were confronted with the Syrian crisis, and to a minor extent, the central Mediterranean migration moves. You see also that although we were referring to Hungary, they received quite a number of people, but they were on their way to Germany. Frau Merkel, who argued not that they were welcome, but we're schaffen das. We can deal with this problem. So this is also, well, take it as an illustration. Here, the top countries of origin, Syrian, Kosovo, clearly not to be considered as a country, as an unsafe third country. Afghanistan, Albania, certainly not to be considered as an unsafe country. Iraq, Eritrea is more doubtful, certainly. Serbia, certainly not to be considered. So these people had to be sent back and readmitted in their home countries. Ukraine, for example, well, the same goes for that. So a relatively big number of people are coming from areas which were not considered to be safe, which were not considered as unsafe third country. With Afghanistan, it has occurred to me that their member states have applied different kind of assessments. So in certain countries, they have accepted Afghanistan, the country, as an unsafe third country, whereas others were of the opinion that Afghanistan can be considered a safe country. Not yet? Not yet. It's horrible. The first proposals of the Commission with regard to safe third countries were the Western Balkans. And even that proposal has not been accepted. It's really... It's a very bad outcome in a way, because we argue all the time. We have put in place the legislation, but the outcome can clearly be different depending on the country where you apply for asylum. That's the reason why certain migrants try to profit from a secondary migration move, because the answer which you might get in Amsterdam is different compared to the one in Athens, for example. And I think that's a very bad outcome as well. So, the Balkans, yes. Egypt, well, I put it in the midst. Is Egypt to be considered a safe third country? I think it might easily be that there are different opinions within the EU, within the Schengen context. Just to illustrate the situation, here we are in 2015, well, and here the reference is to Greece, that's your country, which has really performed a very difficult task, which is crystal clear, in Italy, upcoming, although now the position is reversed with regard to the central Mediterranean move, but indeed the reference is to the 2015 situation. Yeah? So, and this is clearly September and October 2015. Just, well, here are the migration routes where the people went into, tried to get into the Schengen area, so the free movement area. And you can notice here that at a certain moment, so people got access to Hungary, and as a reaction on this massive influx of people, the Hungarians closed their borders or built fences and so on and so forth, or waved them through, as the Italians, by the way, have also done that. They waved them through at a certain moment. But this is just the most important avenue was from the Eastern Mediterranean route, and to a lesser extent, at least in 2015, is the Central Mediterranean. But it's now upcoming. It's upcoming, and you see also here the Western Mediterranean, Western African route. This was from hell to heaven. So the Wir schaffen das. We want to go to Germany to Angela Merkel, and you can see the Balkans. So they paved the way and they waved them through, which was indeed an unpleasant experience for the German government, and which also has now resulted in quite restrictive an agreement in the context of the formation of a new government in Berlin. So they have now introduced restricted numbers of migrants, and also with regard to family reunification. So they aim at limiting, nevertheless, numbers of refugees, migrants, and family members, which is rather striking. The top recipient states, but again, the situation is to 2015, Germany, Hungary, but they were a country which waved them through after a while. Sweden did quite a number of performances, also in the area of legal migration. So they really have accepted quite a number of migrants, Syrians, well-educated Syrians, to have access to their labor market. Italy, Austria, France, UK, the Netherlands. We received more than 50,000, which is quite a number for a country of 17 million, but indeed, relatively speaking, not that high numbers. And for the Netherlands, of course, differently compared to Hungary, for example, we are a migration country. Over the centuries, we have profited from migration movements, whether it was as a result of religious wars, of whatever kind of movements. So we have profited enormously from migrants coming to the Netherlands. Open society, small country with an international orientation. So, and for Belgium, it's a bit of the same. Well, this is also, I mean, whether this is completely correct, that's the question, but where the problem was, of course, related essentially to the Syrian conflict. And this is more or less where they went to. And we should also have some respect and some comprehension of the problems of Turkey. 1.9 million. I don't know why Lebanon is not mentioned here, because they also took on board quite a number of Syrian peoples. But that's just to give you an idea. I don't take this as the clear truth, but it's nevertheless illustrative. And 1.9 million in Turkey is quite a number. Well, that was the scheme, so which was elaborated during the Dutch presidency in the first half of 2016. And the idea was, of course, we have to stop these migration moves. And of course, the background is, do we have to stop the migration of Syrians? Because they're crystal clear should be accepted as beneficiaries of legal protection. But that was also the idea of many politicians in the European Union. We have to create safe havens in the direct neighborhood in question. If it's not Syria, it should be in Lebanon, or why not in Turkey? You see, and now we are trying to accomplish a kind of similar kind of objective in dealing with North African authorities. Very questionable. So the Italians have tried to work out with Libyan, what is it, a government or factions or whatever, quite some deals, which turns out to be very disastrous deals in a way. A lot of crime taking place over there, people being discriminated, held in slavery even, so it's not very easy. But these are the main outcomes of the discussion with Turkey for solidarity and responsibility. And by the way, we paid for that in 2016 over 3 billion euro. But the result has clearly been there, so that the idea to keep Syrians a bit in the neighborhood has been successful to that extent. And the Dutch presidency, or the former, or still our prime minister, is still very proud of that. Although this whole agreement has been subject to all kinds of discussions about misbehavior, the Turkish authorities, discrimination, Syrians being sent back in very dangerous regions in Syria, and so forth and so further. So the whole truth has never been made clear in that respect, I think. Yes?
Yes, I have two questions in relation to the Turkey agreement. One is, how do you compare that with the extraterritorial management of asylum seekers for which we condemn the Australians? Is it not more or less the same thing? And the second, since Turkey does not apply the Geneva Convention for Syrians, it only applies it for Europeans, is it not against are we Europeans not violating our obligations under the Geneva Convention by sending people there?
Well, by returning them. Returning them to safe areas, because since, in fact, Blair was Prime Minister in the UK, we have tried to develop this kind of concept, safe havens in the direct neighborhood of the countries of origin. And indeed, I think whether they apply yes or no, our standard was of secondary importance. Are we now mixed up in a kind of exercise which is contrary to our own principles and values? To a certain extent, that is true. On the other hand, of course, one of the dimensions of this agreement was that when we return people who have not applied for protection, by the way, in the European Union, when we return them, we have accepted the principle that one-to-one we take on board, in the framework of resettlement more or less, people who have applied for protection in Turkey, have been granted protection, and then will be sent to the European Union. So 1-to-1. I mean, it's a very dubious, it's probably as a mechanism, it's very dubious. Politically speaking, it was of course very welcome, but the upper truth has not become very clear so far, I think. So, in a way, yeah, of course, you are participating in an avenue which is not crystal clear and not in conformity with your own values. On the other hand, well, we have reduced the charges here in Greece, in Italy, wherever the European Union, and we take on board 1-to-1. Once we return migrants to Turkey, we take back in the framework of resettlement Syrians or other refugees from Turkey. So it's a bit dubious, this thing. Whether we should condemn it for 100%, there I'm not fully convinced that it's completely bad, but of course it's questionable from several respects. Should we not have done it? I mean, I think the discussions with Libya are much more difficult and complicated compared to this one. And the problem, of course, situation in Turkey is also changing. So in 2016, it is a candidate member state of the European Union, you see. Now we are arguing, Turkey member, no, we're not going to open up chapters for the negotiation. We're not going to close chapters, so the situation has also changed. But the problem, of course, is the situation has changed politically in Turkey, but also in view of numbers. The Syrian crisis is not over, but it has overcome the height of the problems, the civil war. How cruel and difficult that is. So Turkey is hosting more than 2 million people displaced by the conflict in Syria, have been crossed into the EU, and we have made that arrangement, so one by one. So those who are not applying in the EU for protection will be sent back, and on a one-to-one basis we accept that migrants in Turkey in need of protection can be transferred to the European Union. Relocation, that is the issue where we were talking about in the context of Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic, and at that time also Romania, although Romania is now participating in this exercise. A transfer of a person who has made an application for international protection from a member state in charge of examining their application to another member state. So people applying for protection, however, has to be examined, and in view of the numbers, we have to distribute them. And in that context, the proposal of the Commission has been to apply flexibility criteria, depending of the size of the population, total GDP, efforts in the recent past, and unemployment rate. That's my reference also to the Hungarian situation. You said a while ago the economic situation should not be relevant in this concept, but I take it that the Commission has nevertheless paid some attention to this dimension. Size of the total GDP, which is also a reference to economic growth and employment and unemployment. Yeah? The other is the resettlement issue. That's what we have applied essentially in also the relationship with Turkey. Non-EU displaced persons in clear need of protection are being transferred from an EU country to EU member states. Yeah? About quotas, and again, by way of illustration, and you can really see that the efforts which was asked from the Central and Eastern European countries were relatively limited. And I see the reference here to refugee quotas. I do not know exactly what is meant by that, whether these are to be considered, properly speaking, refugees or migrants as such. But this was at least the question of how the idea was to distribute migrants over the member states. And this is the outcome of the votes in the Council. by applying supranational mechanisms, qualified majority voting, in September 2015. So the Greens ones in favor, the yellow ones not participating, the red ones were voting against, and Finland was abstaining. But nevertheless, the vote passed because the conditions for qualified majority voting were fulfilled. Irregular arrivals in the EU, then we are turning to the more recent history, 2015, 2016. The only reason why I show this slide is that, of course, the numbers of migrants have come down rather importantly, especially, of course, in your area. Whether that is completely sound is then the question, because, of course, the arrangement with Turkey has had an impact on this situation. But you can see that in absolute terms, something has changed in this respect. 2015 is the blue, 2016 is the red. And you notice, by the way, also that this is upcoming. So the situation in this I always refer to the second move. The first one was from Turkey, Syria, and the second one is from Central Africa, essentially. Yeah? By way of illustration. Numbers of asylum seekers in EU and EFTA states, because don't forget, Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein are also participating in this context. They are also playing a role, and they are reflected here. Not in very high numbers, but nevertheless, they are participating. Just as illustration here, you see Germany, the first one, the EU and EFTA. So that's the consequence of the EEA, the European Economic Area, and their participation in the Schengen context. Countries of origin, Syria, well, doesn't require some further explanation, but there are quite a number of what we, honestly speaking, should refer to as safe third countries. So Afghanistan is a bone of contention between the member states, but here Eritrea, Albania, Russia, what is it all? So this is Turkey, of course. I mean, you see quite a number. So. And that has to be taken into account, of course, also. The migration routes, and there I wanted to, I hope that I can get that slide. Here we go, and here it's mentioned. I don't know whether you can read it. So this is from this is a commission source. So, and a reference to January, December 2017. Nevertheless, still some 41,000 migrants, out of which 2/3 being of Syrian origin. Yeah. Here we go to the eastern borders of the European Union. Also, 2017, January, November, 751. But then the reference to Vietnam, Ukraine, and the Russian Federation. So that's also another group of people which certainly will not be granted this international protection for 100%. The Western Balkan route, still 11,000, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And then we turn to this one. And here, of course, we are confronted with bigger numbers, but the reference is again to last year, so 2017, 119,000 people. Nigeria, Guinea, and the Côte d'Ivoire. And this is to a smaller extent, but nevertheless also relevant, the Western Mediterranean routes, 20,000, 21,000. The top three nationalities being Morocco, Algeria, and also the Côte d'Ivoire. Canarian Islands, 399. So, but nevertheless, I think it's important. Just that's the situation in 2017. So it's not yet over, the crisis, and just as an illustration, an official source of the European Commission. If I want to skip this one. Thank you very much. Here we see another illustration, but it's simply to mention what is happening here. And the reference is to January 2015. So it's over a period of 3 years. And again, it should not be, that is when the situation was at its height. But each month, I mean, we're referring here only in the month of October to 216 people coming in. And then, of course, the division has been made between the Eastern Mediterranean, so that's the avenue which has caused quite some problems here in Greece, and the Central Mediterranean route. But you can see the differences. 2016, November 2017 have come down in a rather important manner. And here is the comparison between what happened in 2016 and 2017. Irregular arrivals per month. Well, the reason I wanted to show you is this is the percentage of numbers going down, so for 67%, resulting in a total number at that time 13,740, and compared to 5,326. Border crossings by sea. This is a reference to a document of the Council. So it should be correct. And this is where they are coming from. Here, irregular arrivals per nationality. The reference is here to the period January-November 2017. I just give it for your illustration. So it's not completely the same period compared to this one, because this is going back to 2015. Here we are referring to 16 and 17, but you can see that the impact Syria has on the numbers has gone down increasingly, whereas of course in the African countries have gone up, which results in this kind of numbers, 160,000 and close to 40,000. Again, as an illustration. Well, this is also a reference to, well, of course, the horrifying events taking place in the Mediterranean, but the numbers of saved people, rescued people. And the reference is here to European Union kind of activities. So developed in the framework of Frontex, so this agency, which is now called the European Border and Coast Guard. But the references are different. So it's the Triton and Poseidon, so that's these ones, running from January 2016, November 2017. Whereas for Sophia, here in the midst, it's January 16 to December 2017. But nevertheless, I mean, it's 2016 and 17 combined. Numbers are impressive, but unfortunately, numbers of casualties also are impressive. Well, then this brings us to the final conclusions with regard to this bigger problem of migration. Is it a common problem, or can we leave essentially responsibilities with the countries responsible for the control at the external borders? I think there we can easily agree that it is a common problem which has to be solved commonly. And certainly the background is what we discussed during our first hour, is the functioning of the internal market. So once you create a free space, qualified and characterized by free movement, you have also to provide a safe situation at the external border, and that is clearly a collective responsibility. That's why the reference is solidarity. We cannot deny the impact on national societies, populism, Germany, but on the other hand, nevertheless, the numbers are relatively limited. That's what you said, and I think you are right. It's not a European problem. It has become a European problem, and my point has always been, should we not internationalize this? Perhaps it's already too late now to do that. And the final solution, that was the reference to the future agenda of Mr. Tusk, and that's a discussion of tomorrow when we will deal with asylum, and the day after immigration, when we take all these individual topics, when we will analyze them, the one after the other. So that is the migration discussion. So far, so good. Questions, comments? We have raised a number of questions and comments. Because I had still prepared a smaller presentation with regard to how we are dealing with the borders, the external borders, and the visa, which are the countries, citizens of which, once they want to have access to the European. So that's more the topic related to legal migration and the visa. I hope that I can find that one, because mine... Voila, voila, voila. Wow, that's very good. Thank you very much. Or do you want to have a break? We can also have a very short break, and then we finish it off in 3/4 of an hour. So the idea was to present to you the global problem, the migration problem, which has been done now. And of course, there are a couple of dimensions of this problem. And obviously, the border control is an essential one. And I want to combine it with the visa requirements, because that's, of course, linked to the borders issue. A third country national who is required to ask for a visa before entering the European Union, wherever it may be, that's an issue which is happening and being experienced at our external borders. So that's the situation, and here I want still to come back on this issue, internal border controls, external border controls. So I hope you have understood the logic. So the lifting of the border controls internally was clearly linked to the treaty objective to establish an internal market. Let's be clear. So you cannot liberate movement without having abolished passport or identity controls. But as we discussed in the first hour, it took a while before this issue was covered by the European Union as an organization, because earlier on, Schengen was an accomplishment in the intergovernmental context. So from an institutional point of view, the background of the internal border controls was not the supranational framework of the European Union, but came later. And then certainly we have to deal with the external border controls, where since, of course, in Eastern Europe, when the new member states came in 2004, 2007 and 2013 for Croatia, we had to realize that, in fact, because of historical reasons, reference is foremost to the Habsburg history, we had to respect family relations, traffic relations in the neighboring areas, whether it's Belarus or Ukraine or Moldova, etc., etc. And that has given rise to a mechanism which is called the local border traffic regime. And certainly we have reinforced, the European Union has reinforced its efforts to control the external borders, but still the main responsible authorities are the member states themselves. And when we are referring to a short stay, but that's more the reference to legal migration, with regard to the visa requirement, we are referring to short stays of people 90 days out of a total period of 180 days. So you get your visa for 90 years, but you can migrate back and forth in a total period of 180 years. So this is more on the details. Again, the presentation is here on the Schengen states. The green ones here are the ones not yet participating, and by the way, Cyprus is also not participating, as you may notice here. But in a way, their situation is being compared with Greece, because so far not surrounded by Schengen countries, but of course Bulgaria and Romania are on the list to be introduced. My feeling is that will happen within 1 or 2 years. So there are a couple of member states reluctant to accept them, not so much because they're not able to organize external border controls properly, but because of the internal rule of law situation, the reference more particularly being to corruption. Then there are a number of countries, the non-EU Schengen states, Norway, Iceland, Switzerland and Liechtenstein. Switzerland is connected to the Schengen in a very particular manner. So Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein, they are partners in the European Economic Area. They are full-fledged partners of the Schengen cooperation, whereas Switzerland, it required a number of agreements to get them de facto involved, but de jure, they have a separate regime. And obviously, Ireland and UK have never applied for membership of Schengen. They already before the discussion was started in the EU context about free travel area between member states, they invoked their free travel regime, which is already dating back for historical reasons for a long time ago. So in fact, Ireland and the UK practiced already a kind of mini Schengen regime, which was respected. But certainly also the United Kingdom more particularly didn't want to have this topic being transferred to the European Union. That's because of political reasons. So the institutional dimension of that problem. So this is the way we are now dealing with these control mechanisms. The internal borders, it's full application to Schengen acquis, which means that in principle there is an absence of any control on persons, movements by persons. However, we have experienced quite a number of exceptions, migrant crisis being one of them, and they have now been codified, so to say. So, and of course the background of all this is to the extent the public order, public security and public health is put in danger, then obviously you should have an argument, a justification to reintroduce border controls, however, on a temporary basis. There are 3 cases for reasons of completeness I wanted to, and there is also listed in the reading list. The regulation is very recent, so it's really updated, and it tries to translate experience so far. There are 3 particular cases here in question. Foreseeable cases. What could you imagine to be considered a foreseeable case which might justify reintroduction, although temporarily, of internal border controls? What could be understood by a foreseeable case? What do you think? Not the migration crisis, could perhaps have been foreseen, but that was not in this category. What do you think? What kind of events may give rise to, for good reasons, justified, reasons for reintroduction of temporary border control. War to be foreseen? Yeah, well, that's more in the other category, I'm afraid. So require immediate action or something, that you give a follow-up to an event which is taking place but has not been foreseen. What is an event which you can foresee which might give rise to temporary reintroductions of border control? Yes, of course. The hooligans and so on. So drugs, perhaps. But so there was, for a quite long period, the Netherlands have been in conflict with France with regard to this issue, and not to be foreseen. But the French, that was still in the time when President Chirac was president, he closed the borders between France and Belgium because of his concern about drug addicts coming from the Netherlands, or French people trying to buy and trade in stuff and drugs in the Netherlands, and so forth and so forth. But sport events are the most obvious example in this context. A case requiring immediate action, just a reference, I think, to the Balkan Wars. And the third one is, of course, of a more fundamental nature, when clearly there are difficulties, and that's the reference to the Mediterranean, when there is being detected deficiencies in the way the Schengen system, overall speaking, is functioning. So that's more the reference to the Mediterranean. It's not simply up to the standard. The references are here on this slide, Article 25 and 26. Foreseeable events giving rise to a serious threat to public policy or internal security. Well, indeed, reference sport events and these kind of things. The idea, but it's simply the way it has been drafted and concluded, references to 30 days. An event, a tournament, takes 3 weeks or something like that. And the outcome of the negotiations in Brussels has been for 30 days for the foreseeable, or for the foreseeable duration of the event, might be shorter, perhaps might be a bit longer, and the total period shall not exceed 60 days. And we have not yet had an experience of such a temporary reintroduction for these kind of reasons, which have gone beyond the period of 60 days. So far, so good. And of course, this is the initiative is with the member states concerned. He has to notify, but in a way it gives rise to a margin of discretion to reintroduce these kind of temporary border controls. The other one is when immediate action is needed. Again, the reference is to a serious threat to public policy, internal security. These are the traditional exceptions for free movement, is it? I mean, so from a legal perspective, internal market, whether you deal with free movement of goods, persons, capital or services, there are 3 main general exceptions. You have to do public order, public security, and the public health, by the way. But health is not referred to here, but could, of course, also be a point. Serious diseases and so on could give rise, probably also, could also be covered by these kind of exceptions. For a limited period of up to 10 days, it's up to the member state to prolong it. Total period should not exceed. So this is the margin of discretion of the member state concerned. And the notification has to be done in order to allow the Commission to come in with an alternative approach. The Commission, because this is subject of supranational cooperation, the Commission has the competence to come forward with an alternative proposal. But this is, in a way, a part of sovereignty of the member state himself to invoke this article, differently compared to this one. Because if we are confronted with the threat in the functioning of the Schengen area, totally speaking, then the idea is we should involve formally the European Union legislator, which obviously is the Council in question, And then, of course, upon a proposal put forward by the European Commission, and that's the reasons here, that is the criteria which has to be fulfilled, then the Council may recommend on a proposal of the Commission that one of our member states decide to introduce the border control. Why do you think the European Parliament is left out here? Is this a real risk for democracy within the European Union? Why do you think the Council, because in the end it's up to the Council which has decided this kind of, why did we leave out the European Parliament in this discussion? Well, you can guess what the reason was or has been. But why the Parliament should not have a place here? What is your inclination? The urgency. Don't you think so? The urgency. And obviously, the Commission is involved, and the final result is a recommendation. So it's a bit, from an institutional perspective, it's a bit kind of soft domain. Did we experience this? We have experienced it, but has not given rise to these kind of discussions. So there was a risk for the Schengen regime, but this is the regulation dating back to only 2016, so after the crisis, well, after the height of the crisis, so to say. But so this is in fact a codification of what should have happened before, but in fact the Schengen system was constantly deficient, was not functioning at all. When you had to bear all the charges, the workload for all the applications coming in and migrants coming in from Turkey, etc., etc. So it was constantly in this situation. However, and that gave rise to the nice document of the Commission, Back to Schengen. At that time, they were of the opinion that we can restore the situation in 18 months or so. And I think these 18 months have already been passed. So. But formally speaking, this is the regime. So there are three categories: foreseeable, immediate action, and a deficiency in the overall functioning of the system. Okay? Yes? This is the way we are dealing with the external border control. Well, the highlights, so to say. Of course, we are dealing with personal luggage animals. I've never read the handbooks of Schengen. They are thick as that. I was involved in the negotiations for Schengen, and although we are all very happy with Schengen, at that time, institutionally, the Netherlands was not very happy with the Schengen as a framework cooperation, but that had to do with what we discussed during the first hour. We would have preferred to see the Schengen system developing within the European Union instead of separately in an intergovernmental context. Because one of the deficiencies of Schengen has always been there was no Schengen Parliament, there was no Schengen Court of Justice, it was purely intergovernmental, and the discussions were taking place in, how do you call that, the backyard and so on. And in fact, I still remember, because I was involved at that time on behalf of the Netherlands in the negotiation for Schengen, but we had tremendous difficulties to have this convention, the implementing convention I'm referring to, by the Dutch Parliament. So it was very close to a rejection because of these reasons. Purely intergovernmental, no parliamentary control, no judicial control. But of course, since Maastricht and later on Amsterdam Treaty, Nice Treaty, ultimately Lisbon, it has now been, you might argue, fully supranationalized. Then, of course, we have installed a number of information systems. As a reference to privacy, it's a bit tricky, this topic, but we can collect information about suspects of crime, a member of terrorist groups, terrorists themselves, I don't know what. So people with a risk can be collected, information can be collected. Examples, missing children obviously is a correct ID, perpetrators of a serious crime. The question is, what is a serious crime, and so on, giving rise to all kinds of legal interpretations and so on. But Schengen has given rise to its own, and because Schengen is clearly connected to, in this context, to the external borders, it's clearly connected to people giving rise to threats for our public order, national security, and so forth and so further. Local border threats, just for reasons of completeness, it's nevertheless interesting. So Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Romania. I think in the Balkans you might also have the example Hungary, the Vojvodina in Serbia, and so on. So for historical reasons, families have been separated, shopping areas have been split, and so forth, so forth. So I think, by the way, also in a way, Kaliningrad has profited from this mechanism in order to allow Russians who were used to shop in Lithuania. I mean, I'm referring to a long time back, by the way, but to shop in either Lithuania or in Poland, to allow them to do that. So in a way, we have facilitated also when Poland Lithuania exceeded, we have in a way also facilitated Russian inhabitants in Kaliningrad. Should we recall where? Here. I'm referring, of course, to this area here, in between Lithuania and Poland. But certainly here, Belarus, Ukraine, and here in the Western Balkans, the Vojvodina. And that's why the local border traffic regime has been created. It was very funny. Institutionally, it's an interesting topic. For border residents who frequently need to cross the external borders of the Union, it enables Poland to conclude a bilateral agreement with the neighboring non-EU country so that border residents can travel back and forth without the requirement to ask for a Schengen visa, and therefore without any impediment to trade, social, cultural interchange in the region concerned. Now, to a certain extent, this problem has been solved since Ukraine, Georgia is not a good example here, but Moldova is, have concluded, as you may know, an association agreement, a deep, comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union. And one of the implementing measures have been facilitation, liberalization of visa requirements. So to a certain extent, the objective which this kind of regulation tries to serve has been solved through another perspective, that is the outcome and the implementation of the association agreement with a number of these non-EU countries referred to here in this text. But for reasons of completeness. Well, this is the famous Frontex. Originally, the focus was to the eastern borders, politically important borders. However, and the point is always, and that's the same story when we will discuss on Wednesday, shortly, by the way, because I'm not able to take on board the whole chapter on police cooperation. The same is true with Europol. Europol is an instrument which facilitates exchange of information, cooperation by the member states. However, it has not really executive powers to prosecute itself and so on. So here, the member state, this is clearly the state where we are in. For issues touching upon, as I call it, roots of national societies, which is public order, national security, the roots of national society. I mean, the member states themselves are the primary responsible authorities. And that's the same for this area as well. It assists, that's why the reference is still to assist the authorities of the member states, having its seat in Warsaw. I do not know how many people are working there now, but it's over 1,000. I don't know whether you have that information. But they started with a couple of hundred people, but in view of the problems, especially in the Mediterranean, and this number has increased and is now active, of course, in the context, that's the next slide, when also the logo of Frontex have changed, European Border and Coast Guard. It's a new mandate. So having this, but still the seat of the organization, and we call it now a formal an agency. So it's not an institution, it's not an organ, it's an agency. And this is one of them. The latest version, yeah, I'll come back to that one. Eurosur in between, that's a mechanism which especially has been developed in view of how to control delicate external borders, and the Mediterranean being one of them, through mechanism which implies digital exchange information, but new working methods by also involving drones, satellites, airplanes, and cameras. So it's not only events taking place on the ground, but from the air. And Eurosur is a rather subtle mechanism, European border surveillance system, and also with the main responsibility in the hands of the member states, however, assisted by Frontex. And through a network of national coordination centers. I do not exactly know, I have no experience how that functions in practice, to improve the situation awareness. And of course, in the Mediterranean, it was highly needed to get a better picture of the situation. Formally, it's called for the purpose of detecting, preventing, combating illegal migration. This is the European Border and Coast Guard. The Commission is always very proud of the fact that within 9 months it was formally concluded, decided upon by the European legislator, European Parliament being involved, by the way, certainly, because this is not a temporary mechanism. This is a structural mechanism. So this has gone through my guess is the ordinary legislative procedure with the Parliament fully on board as the co-legislative authority, and the reference to 2016 was relatively recent. I don't know what 2016, 24 of the 14th of September. Yeah, so within 9 months, which is quite an achievement, going back and forth, proposal of the Commission, provisional position of the Council, back to the European Parliament, conciliation, what you have, and then formally conclusion within a period of 9 months. It replaces the earlier versions of the Frontex regulations and ensures the European integrated border management at the external border with a view to manage blah, blah, blah. However, this is the caveat. Although it's a new mandate, it's nevertheless, the main responsibility to exercise the external border controls is in the hand of the member states. However, this kind of subtle kind of improvement, the Frontex agency has the possibility to intervene, to notify to the Commission and the Council deficiencies. That's a reference, of course, also to what we discussed in the context of the temporary reintroduction, but that was related to internal border controls. This is related to lacunas in the system of the external border regime. They have the right to intervene, and they are also more and more involved in the exercise to return and have readmitted illegal migrants, to send them back to their country of origin and have them accepted in that country of origin. This is the new logo, so Frontex now being referred to as the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. So member states will continue to keep their competence and sovereignty over their borders. On the other hand, and that's my wording, by the way, the Border and Coast Guard will provide support to the member state and being able to identify and to intervene to address weaknesses in advance and not when it is too late. That's at least the idea. So you can see we have arrived halfway, is it? But it's typically a topic which is really very close to the fundamental interest of a member state, national security. Member states very reluctant to hand over the responsibility to a European organization. Visa. Other topic, the reference is now to the legal migration, but the events are taking place at the external borders, so that's why I wanted to refer to that one. And of course we have to distinguish between short stay visa and long stay titles, which is in the domain of legal migration and asylum seekers being fully recognized as legal migrants. So this is with regard to short stay, also for reasons of completeness. It is being developed in the Schengen context, Denmark being a partner in that exercise, although Denmark has a full, as you may have discussed during the introductory lectures, so they are not participant in the whole domain of the area of freedom, security and justice. However, they were committed to respect their earlier obligations, and that was the reason, because Schengen was an intergovernmental kind of project. They were involved in that project, so they are also committed to the future events of the Schengen project these days. So they are involved, whereas the UK and Ireland are outside. Then the reference was always to grey lists. So when we started this kind of experience, also in light of the experience of the Balkan Wars, there was still a grey list. So there was an effort to decide on yes or no, so black or white, but there was also a huge grey list. That's a reference also to the discussion of safe third countries in a way. Now we have tried to solve this issue. It's either black or white. That should also be of a certain importance in the context of the discussion on what is a safe third country. But one way or the other, it has not as yet achieved a lot. For example, I come back to that because I have also a picture on Afghanistan is clearly in the domain of a black. So they're in that domain. Pakistan is in the context of countries whose citizens, if they have the ambition to come to the European, have to ask for a visa. Regulation 2.3 has been regularly amended. 2001, my guess is that we still practice a gray list, whereas now it's black or white. And the document is harmonized as to the condition, procedure, and requirements, security requirements. So it says a uniform document. And it has established its own database for visa requirements. So fingerprints and so on, information, people asking for a visa, etc., etc. So it's not in the same category of Schengen, because Schengen is more a reference to national security, and although missing children were also in that database, this is another database. And time has come to connect these ones, the more so because also in this context it gives rise to discussions about violation of privacy and so on. But we still practice a separate database. Perhaps you must help me here again, because I try to click on, but you're much more clever than I am, just to show you where we are now. And it's a moving target, this one. It's, I think it should come. It's also the commission, yes. No, but you were, la. Oops. Here we come. Here we go. I want to go to this one. And then making it a big, how can I do that? Scroll, eh? How to make it bigger. Very good. Thank you very much. Well, this is the outcome of, this is the situation. That's why I'm not able to present you, this is just a kind of moving picture. It might change from one day to one. And you notice here, Ukraine is in the green area, like Moldova. It's very nice picture, very nice screen. So, Here's Moldova, green, Georgia, green, Ukraine, green. Local border traffic, so we don't need that regulation anymore for these kind of movements. And in fact, you can, if you hint on the, but okay, never mind. So Japan, Australia, Malaysia, Southern America, Russia is in the red, although Russia profits from facilitation agreements. Facilitation. I have also a sheet on that. This is Schengen, certainly. These are the green ones. You see that this is Croatia, not yet Schengen, but of course without visa requirements. But here are the ones, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, etc., in the green domain. Kosovo, the red spot, Kosovo. Independence of which has not been fully recognized by all the member states, as you may know. I do not know the numbers. There were 6 at the time who didn't recognize the independence. So Kosovo is still in the area of the visa requirements, like is Turkey, etc. This is a reference to countries, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan. They also need, when they come by plane to the European Union, and if they are on transit, they need a transit visa. So if they want to come to Amsterdam and to move to Norway, because they are a partner in this, then they need, in the international zone of our Schiphol Amsterdam airport, a separate kind of document, the transit visum. And certainly Japan is that. But this is the situation at present. And the funny thing is, there is still another one. Oh, how to get out of this one. Going back to the bottom. Yes, thank you. Okay. Visa facilitation and liberalization. It's a bit complicated, but these are the countries who have been liberated, and these are the countries who have been facilitated. Kaliningrad being part of that. And obviously here there is the reference to liberation and facilitation for even Armenia and Azerbaijan. And the explanation is on this one. So you can have to distinguish between facilitation and liberation. This is, of course, lifting, abolishment of the obligation to ask for a visa. This is only to speed up, to make it simpler, quicker, more efficient. So make it easier to issue visa for short stay in the Schengen area. Simplified, reduced fees, and so on and so further. So this is the situation, and after the association agreements with this country, that country, Moldova and Georgia, they are in the area of the liberalization agreements. And this is an example of the document. Who is coming from a third country in this audience? Nobody, I suppose. No. But, so this is a European model. It's a national document, but it's tailor-made after the prescriptions and requirements of the European provisions, European legislation. Specimen. And that's it. And that's enough for today, isn't it? Thank you very much.